So this video is about why there are decimals, which probably nobody ever bothered to tell you about. They just said they're there. But there's one reason why decimals exist and why they were actually invented. They're not that old. Decimals exist because they make it easier to compute. They are much easier to work with than fractions. Now you may argue about this because you might be using fairly simple fractions, but let's take the example of, say, 23 over 51 and the example of 62 over 153, which are actually not that bad fractions, but they are pretty nasty. So if I asked you which one is bigger, looking at this, it's like, oh, I don't know. I mean, the denominators are different. I could probably play around with it and figure something out, but it's hard. And in fact, the easiest way is to turn both of these into decimals. I'm going to show, there's a video about that later on. It's basically a division problem, 23 divided by 51, 62 divided by 153, and I'm going to let you use calculators for that. But if you do that division, you get this first number is 0.450, and the second number is 0.405. And it's obvious, looking at this, that 0.450 is bigger than 0.405. So that's the first thing to say about that. One thing I want to say is that, and I want to tell you the second, the dirty secret about decimals is that they are not exact. 23 over 51 is not exactly 0.450. 62 over 153 is not exactly 0.405, but there's lots of times when you can use numbers that aren't exact and they work perfectly well. For example, when you're dealing with money, or in general, when you're dealing with most real applications. Because in most real-world applications, you don't have to have exact numbers. You don't need to get down to, if you think about, measuring things, right? You're measuring something because you want to cut it. You don't have to cut you can't cut in exactly the right place because the thing you're cutting with has a thickness. So most of the time it's okay as long as you can control how much you're wrong by, believe it or not, and that's actually a mathematical tool, is to figure out how much of a mistake are you making, and is that mistake okay? Then you're willing to make that mistake for the purpose of making your computations much easier. Okay, so let's take a look at 0.450. That we're going to talk about that. That literally means 450 out of 1,000. So the idea of decimals is that they are actually taking a fraction and making them as close as possible to a fraction out of a power of 10. So out of 10, out of 100, out of 1,000, out of 10,000. Okay, so this would be 405 over 1,000. And they're also easier to add and subtract, multiply and divide. That's the basic thing. Decimals are easier to compute with than fractions are. And that's why people use them, even though they are wrong. They are incorrect. They have errors in them. So the point to using decimals, especially if you're going to use a calculator, is to figure out what the error is. And that's why, you ever do something on a calculator and you get a number like, oh, I'm dividing this number by this number and I get 0.43615822417. And students always ask, well, what is that? What do I do? It's big, ugly decimal. And the answer is you probably only need a part of it. You probably only need to go to the thousandths place or the 10,000ths place, or maybe at most the 100,000ths place. So it's important to know about the place value. But that's why we use decimals, because they're easier to compute with.